of both the USDA Farm Service Agency and the USDA Natural Resources Conservation Service. Pat Lechner is the Price Support, Conservation, and Environmental Programs Chief with the Nebraska State FSA Office. And Brach Johnson is the Outreach Coordinator with Nebraska-NRCS State Office. Thanks to both of you for joining us. We'll again bring you up in time for the discussion. But I first want to point to Randy Sainer. Randy's an extension educator, a beef systems educator with Nebraska Extension out in North Platte. Randy is with us to talk about sort of assessing the reality of where we stand today, the current conditions and the challenges that producers are facing. So Randy, without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you share a brief presentation here.
Yes, I'm going to try to share my screen, and it's telling me, okay, there we go. At the top. Oh, no. Sorry, guys. Just let me get on the right one. And from beginning. Okay, so you can see this is the drought monitor for May 3rd. Of course, we had some rain over the weekend before the drought. So I've got the next slide is a drought monitor. Notice the red area is going to decrease a little bit. Things improve a little bit, but really not a lot. For the next one. Okay, there we go. So this is the May 10th one, and you can see that red area has decreased a little bit. But again, if you look at the drought monitor, we're still very dry. The rains have helped us, but things we're seeing out there is, we have the lowest hay supply in about 50 years. Because of this western drought, a lot of hays went there, and we didn't have the best hay crop last year. Some areas did, some didn't, but again, our hay supplies are low, and so that's affected our producers, as well as grass, and we had our rains, but they were a little late, so some of our cool season grasses will probably be reduced. This is the map from May 2nd. It doesn't have the most recent rain in it. You can see there's a little bit of blue in Nebraska, but still quite a bit of red. That panhandle area, which has been dry for about 3 years, and the southwest, I'm from the North Platte area, but south of me, they continue to have a pretty dry area there. You can see it in red. Not a lot of soil moisture there. This is just grazing and how much we expect from grazing forage production. And you can see that if we get normal rains, that's what this map is here. So if we get normal rains the rest of the year, we're still in a lot of counties down about 15 to 5% in production. And if we don't get a lot of rain, which there is some predictions that this is going to continue, this drought in the western United States, then we'll even see as low as between 15 and 30% reduction in a lot of areas. So that means less forage available for livestock, and we're already seeing producers have a record number of selling cull cows. So and as well as crops, but I'm more of a cattle guy, so that's kind of what I focus on. But we're seeing quite a bit of cows go to market, and there's a reason they're trying to reduce their stocking rate because of that. This also happens because of the drought, and this is a 702 fire. You can see how large it is. This is just one of many that's happened in the state of Nebraska. So all those things are affecting producers, and in a lot of cases, a lot of hay was burned up in this area, as well as delayed turnout because the grass is starting to come back because it got a rain. Some of the irrigation wells were burned up in this, and there's a lot of things that happen. It's a very devastating fire for Southwest Nebraska. And there's my contact information if you got more questions, but I'm going to let the USDA people get in and talk about the things they offer to help producers, because I see a lot of need out there for producers after the fire and the continued drought. Thank you.
Randy, thank you for setting the stage and recognizing sort of the current conditions we have. We know we're in drought conditions, and that the recent rains haven't solved that in one fell swoop. But to recognize where we are, to realize the losses we've had, and to understand the challenges going forward, that's where producer decisions matched up with and working integrated with some of the programs available to producers is an important consideration here. First, we're talking about the FSA, the Farm Service Agency. And Pat Lechner, as I mentioned, is the Price Support, Conservation, and Environmental Programs Chief. So Pat, let me look to you and ask you to share your presentation and talk about the programs available from FSA and the implications for producers. And we'll hope, Pat, that things are working out. We had some bandwidth challenges getting the FSA presentations up here. So. Pat, have you been successful trying to share the presentation? Thus far, we can't hear you or see anything here. Here we go. All right, we see the PowerPoint presentation, or at least the file, and if you start the presentation, it looks like we'll be sharing the right slides. But we still don't hear you, Pat.
The host.
Brad, can you hear me?
Yes, Pat, we can hear you now.
Okay. Can you see my PowerPoint?
And we can see the PowerPoint program. So if you hit the slide presentation, we can go directly to the slides.
There we go.
Okay. Well, we're seeing your preview mode here now. Up at top there on the display settings. Nope. Shortcut in there. Please share it again. We'll get through the technicals here. And go ahead and share again, or go ahead and start the presentation. All right, and up in display settings, just above the slide, just hit duplicate or swap. Yeah. Hey, we now see a slide, and I think I hear you, so let's proceed.
Okay, I apologize. Geez, wow, what technical issues there. But as Brad had mentioned, I'm Pat Lechner, Price Support Conservation Chief with the Nebraska Farm Service Agency. Just really want to say thank you for the opportunity to come and speak to you guys on some of the programs that we offer in regards to drought. So we'll touch on basically the portfolio that we have, and then we will make these slides available to anyone that would like to see them. There'll be a lot of information on them, but I'll hit the highlights because there is a lot of detail in these programs. So the Farm Service Agency's portfolio when it comes to disaster assistance, in particular drought in this scenario, we offer the Livestock Forage Program, LFP, the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program, which we call ELRP, Emergency Conservation Program. We do offer some flexibility under the Conservation Reserve Program when we do see drought conditions, the Tree Assistance Program, and then finally the Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program, which is a little bit different than the other parts of our portfolio, as the majority are reactive programs to the disaster, and our NAP program is more proactive in a form of a catastrophic insurance policy. Much of our reactive programs that I'm going to talk about today are based right off the Drought Monitor. And so when we see conditions that reach D2 or D3 or D4 and beyond, that's generally when we're going to see our programs come into play. So as we move through the PowerPoint slide, I'll kind of describe when we see these triggers hit and when it applies to each specific program. When you look at, I know you guys have probably already seen this from the previous slides, but here's our current U.S. Drought Monitor, where we're sitting at in Nebraska. And like I had mentioned, our programs are gonna trigger off of what we see D2 for a certain consecutive weeks, D3, D4. So I'll work through those as we work through the slides. The first program we're gonna look at is the Livestock Forage Program. And this program provides financial assistance to livestock producers who are suffering a grazing loss due to an eligible drought condition. We look directly off the U.S. Drought Monitor to determine when this program is going to come into play. The most important things to remember about LFP is that a producer must have eligible livestock, they must have eligible grazing land, and that must be in place at the time of the disaster event. A little bit more about the Livestock Forage Program. When we talk about eligible livestock, it's going to be the livestock that you think of that's relative to Nebraska here, as far as beef, buffalo, anything else that's being raised for commercial purposes. And that's the main important factor when we look at LFP. These livestock must be maintained for commercial purposes. You must have owned, leased, purchased, or entered into a contract to purchase those livestock 60 days prior to the beginning of the qualifying drought. And then, as mentioned on the slides, feedlot animals are not eligible. When we look at eligible producers, they must have owned that livestock 60 calendar days before the beginning of the qualifying drought. They must have pasture land or grazing land for the covered livestock. That can be in the form of owned, cash rented, or any other agreement so that they show that they have risk in that pasture land or grazing land. They must certify that they suffered a loss due to drought. And then from an FSA program or software standpoint, they must have timely filed an acreage report on that grazing land. When we look at the deadline for grazing land in Nebraska, it's July 15th annually. So looking at LFP and when we take into consideration the Drought Monitor and when we see payments trigger or eligibility trigger for LFP, the first trigger that we primarily see would be 8 consecutive weeks during the normal grazing season at D2. So grazing season set for Nebraska, May 1 to October 15th. When we get 8 consecutive weeks of D2, that's going to trigger a 1-month payment factor. If we move on to D3 or D4, D3, at any time, if we hit D3, we have met that 3-month payment factor for eligibility for the LFP. Looking at last week's Drought Monitor to this week's Drought Monitor, you will see that some of these counties in south central Nebraska and in northern central Nebraska may have been in D3 but have rolled back a little. That's okay in terms of eligibility for LFP. You only have to hit that D3 criteria one time within the grazing season to qualify for the initial 3-month payment factor for LFP. The longer the drought persists, the more months or more payment month factors that we look at. So we basically continue to monitor throughout the grazing season. LFP Native Pasture Program, Program 22-year, This is basically a snapshot of where we are at right now as far as eligible county payment months in Nebraska. Like I had mentioned, you only have to hit it once or hit D3 at any time during the grazing season to move through there. The Livestock Forage Program, obviously going to be a very big workload for Nebraska-FSA across the state as we move through 2022. We have a lot of counties that have already triggered for LFP based on the D3 criteria. So I know it's going to make a significant impact to our farmers and ranchers as we move throughout the grazing season. The next program that we offer is the Emergency Livestock Assistance Program. This program is kind of multifaceted. There's livestock eligibility parts of this, but we also see this program come into play with honeybees, farm-raised fish, things like that. Today, we're going to primarily focus on the livestock aspect and how it affects our producers, or how it can offer assistance to our producers in terms of drought. The areas that ELRP comes into play with drought would be water transportation for livestock, additional mileage for transporting livestock to feed above normal, and then additional expenses of transporting eligible livestock to feed. So maybe moving them to a different pasture because of the drought conditions. And then we'll just talk quick a little bit, some notes on honeybees when we look at additional feed purchases above normal. Drought Monitor, relatively the same as LFP, just a little bit of difference. But this program does trigger directly off the Drought Monitor as well. So D2, 8 consecutive weeks during the grazing season, D3, D4, anytime. So relatively the exact same when we're looking at LFP. So eligible livestock for ELRP, similar to LFP, we're looking at cattle, buffalo, goats, equine, sheep, must be for commercial use, which is going to be your primary target. Same criteria is in play with ownership of livestock 60 days prior to the eligible disaster event. Those livestock must be physically located in the county where the disaster happened. So they must be in the county where the Drought Monitor triggers for that county. And then when we kind of look at ELRP for water or water hauling, they must already have adequate watering facilities at the time of the adverse weather event. And then also when we're talking about water hauling and the eligibility for that, they must not normally have to haul water to those eligible pastures to meet the criteria for ELRP eligibility. First one we'll kind of talk about is ELRP water transportation. ELRP provides financial assistance to livestock producers who are transporting water to eligible livestock on eligible grazing land as a result of an eligible drought. Main criteria: producer must have risk in both eligible livestock and grazing land, and the water must be transported to eligible livestock on grazing land. ELRP is a kind of a two-step process application. So a producer must file a timely notice of loss within 30 calendar days of when the loss becomes apparent. So we're going to, step one, producer realizes that they're going to have a loss due to drought. They're going to contact the office, notify them that they are having a loss. And then once we work through that process, then at the end, we're going to file an application for payment where we actually issue that payment. So each part of ELRP is always the two-step of filing a notice of loss within 30 days of when the loss becomes apparent, and then coming back in and ultimately filing the application for payment. Payments for water transportation, they're based on a formula, and these include water transport equipment fees, labor, and contracted water transportation fees. Does not actually include the cost of water itself. If you guys can see that on my screen, here's the payment formula that we use as a national average price per gallon to transport water, plus other factors. Moving on, if we're looking at this portion of ELRP, which would be additional mileage for transporting livestock feed above normal, ELRP provides financial assistance to livestock producers who are transporting livestock feed additional miles above normal eligibility. So if you already have normal miles that you would travel, this would be anything above that if you're in need of feed. Producers must have risk in the livestock, must have risk in the grazing land. That's all relatively the same. And then it's also the two-step process, same as all of ELAP. How the additional mileage is calculated and then paid, FSA is going to reimburse producers 60% of feed transportation costs above what normally would be incurred in that year. There is some criteria for traditionally underserved producers who would receive 90% payment. How the payment formula is calculated, it's for 2021, and we may see a change in 2022. The cost formula uses $6.60 per mile. We're always going to exclude the first 25 miles, and we're going to exclude anything above 1,000 miles. This is a self-certification program, but in order to ensure that we have all the paperwork we need, in case we would ever see anything that would look like an audit or anything like that, producers should always retain receipts, documentation, anything to help prove the miles that they traveled. Additional expenses of hauling livestock to feed. So as opposed to hauling feed to livestock, this would actually be moving your livestock to eligible grass or different grass that may support those livestock. This was just announced within the last few weeks, so it is a new portion of ELAP. It is going to be retroactive to 2021 due to the drought conditions then, but ultimately it's to provide financial assistance in covering a cost to haul livestock to a new location for feed due to insufficient feed resources as a result of the drought. There is going to be more policy put in place in regards to how we're going to administer this program from FSA and all of its eligibility. But like I had mentioned, there will be more to come with this aspect of ELAP, and we'll be pushing that information out as we get it. Just a quick note on honeybees. ELAP does cover financial assistance to honeybee producers who have to purchase additional feed above normal. If a producer in particular does raise honeybees, I would urge them to contact their FSA office if they feel like they did have to purchase feed above normal, and they can walk you through that process step by step in order to complete your application. Moving away from ELAP, we're looking at the Emergency Conservation Program, or ECP. ECP has a limited role in drought, but it does have its place to provide some financial assistance. Unlike the other programs that I just previously talked about, this program is based off of eligibility, where the county committee, your local FSA county committee, is going to submit evidence to show that the county's precipitation levels are 40%, that they've had a 40% or greater loss for the last 4 months in their normal precipitation levels. Once the county committee feels that they've reached that criteria, they then can request the authority to implement ECP at the county level. Under drought conditions, what ECP can really do for the producers is to provide additional watering facilities in places where they've already existed and they no longer have the ability to keep up as a direct result of the drought conditions. So that may be livestock, it may be anything when we're looking at orchards or vineyards, things like that. It has a little bit of flexibility in that regard. So those water conservation enhancement measures that I kind of mentioned, the eligibility looks like any of those that need to permit livestock grazing to continue to graze on forage or pasture. We're going to supply emergency water for existing irrigation systems that can no longer keep up. And then the main thing with ECP is that they had to have had adequate water prior to the disaster event in order for us to cost share. This is a little bit more about ECP and what it can offer. Talks about the pay limit for those watering facilities if we are going to cost share. They're limited to $500,000 per person or legal entity. Generally, when we look at ECP, it's looking at a 75% cost share in order to install some of those facilities. When you look at socially disadvantaged producers or beginning farmers, that may look more like 90%. So we're looking at equipment, the ability to bring water to those eligible areas under the ECP program. Must have already had water in those areas to begin with. One of the main things that we see when we reach some of these drought conditions is the availability of emergency haying and grazing on CRP acres. And so once we've reached some of that US Drought Monitor criteria, it allows for the county committee to determine whether or not they want to administer CRP emergency haying and grazing. So there's two different parts. We can base it when the drought monitor hits a certain level, or if that drought monitor hasn't reached the level, but the county committee feels they are having a 40% loss in forage production, they may also request to implement emergency haying and grazing. So one of the most important things to remember is that although you may hit that criteria on the drought monitor at a certain point, ultimately it's the county committee's determination on whether or not they think emergency haying and grazing is warranted and whether they want to open it up to their counties. Like always, emergency haying and grazing does require approval prior to haying. So everyone, we just encourage everyone to contact the office, inquire about it, and we can go through the steps in order to have everyone sign up timely and make sure we have all of our ducks in a row before we go out there and hay that CRP. Just some quick facts about emergency haying and grazing. No, there is no rental payment reduction. You are allowed to hay 100% of those eligible acres. I will throw a caveat in that when we take a look at LFP a little bit later. But you must not hay or graze the same acreage in the same program year. And then one thing that has changed over the years is that there is the availability to rent those acres out or to sell the bales from emergency haying and grazing. So, like I had mentioned, emergency haying and grazing is eligible on all practices at 100% of the contract acreage. That does change when the livestock forage program is triggered. So when we reach the level of LFP drought where LFP is triggered, that does reduce some of the availability of emergency haying and grazing. It reduces some of the practices that are allowed. And then it also reduces the amount of availability to hay to 50% as opposed to the full 100%. So if we have emergency haying and grazing authorized without LFP, there's the availability to hay 100% of those acres. If we reach to the drought level where LFP triggers, it does provide some restrictions on what we're going to allow as far as haying and grazing on CRP acres. It's going to cut that in half. And it's also going to limit the practices that are available. When we look at the primary nesting season, it's important to remember that emergency haying and grazing generally is not allowed during the primary nesting season. So May 1 to July 15th. However, if LFP does trigger, another caveat, there is some eligibility for emergency grazing only during the primary nesting season. Moving on to TAP, the Tree Assistance Program. TAP provides financial assistance to eligible orchardists and nursery tree growers to replant and rehabilitate trees, bushes, vines that were all lost by natural disaster. In this situation would be the drought. And so there are some eligibilities about normal mortality and cost sharing anything above normal mortality. Gives a 1-year time frame for the replacements to be put in. And there's a payment formula that works out based on the specific tree or vine that you're looking to replace. So if you have that scenario, contact your local office. They can work you through the TAP Tree Assistance Program. Moving on to the NAP program, or Non-Insured Crop Disaster Assistance Program. different from the programs that I'd spoken about earlier. NAP requires an annual sign up in the front of the year so that we allow producers the opportunity to take out this catastrophic level insurance and then carry it throughout the year in case of disaster. So the one thing that's important to remember about NAP is that the NAP program is eligible for crops, for grasses, anything that federal crop insurance does not consider eligible to carry coverage on. We provide this catastrophic level coverage under the NAP program for those specialty crops and the crops that you cannot receive RMA coverage on. The basic provisions of NAP would be 50-55 coverage, so you must experience a 50% loss, and then FSA is going to take a look at a payment of 55% of the average market price for that crop. They do allow for some buy-up coverage. That's ranging anywhere from 50 to 65% of production in 5% increments, and that's up to 100% of the average market price. One thing to keep in mind, there is no buy-up option for grazing crops. So buy-up coverage must be elected by a producer by the application closing date. So if you're interested in the buy-up coverage, you must do that before the closing date. When you do look at buy-up, there is a premium involved with that, but with all of our NAP coverage, there is the general service fee. One thing to keep in mind is that producers that are considered socially disadvantaged, historically underserved, limited resource, veteran beginning farmers, they do have the benefit of waiving that service fee when they look at taking out a NAP policy. Just in general, eligible producers must apply for by the deadline or that coverage. They must have paid their service fee, and all of the application closing dates for 2022 have passed. But when we look at just some general options that we have for alfalfa, mixed forages, apples, aronia berries, grapes, we're looking at a November closing date for 2023. So that would be November of this year for 2023 coverage. So here's just a snapshot of what we've taken into consideration, or what we're beginning to offer to the wildfire victims that we've seen in Nebraska. A little bit different from the drought, but a lot of these programs that we offer overlap for this type of natural disaster. We're implementing LIP, ELAP, and ECP on a lot of these wildfire on these lands that are affected by wildfire. Just some general information of what we're seeing on the horizon under the Emergency Relief Program. If you've seen, the Extending Government Funding and Delivering Emergency Assistance Act was signed into law last September. It provides $10 billion in assistance to agricultural producers impacted by wildfires, droughts, hurricanes, and other eligible disasters from 2020 and 2021. In particular, the Act specifically targets $750 million to provide assistance to livestock producers for losses incurred during the drought or wildfires in 2021. What we've already rolled out from an FSA standpoint is the Emergency Livestock Relief Program, or what we call ELRP, Phase 1. We provided a payment or assistance to producers who qualified and received a payment for the Livestock Forage Program in 2021. So if you had a 2021 LFP application, you automatically qualified for ELRP, and we made a payment of 75% of what you had received under your 2021 LFP application. There's a lot of information out there. We have no details at this time, whether we're looking at an ELRP Phase 2, which we do believe will be coming. And then part of that funding may also capture some emergency relief programs related to crops. So, like I said, not a whole lot of information out there at this time. And so I don't want to go into details on any of these items, as we're still waiting to hear on how we're going to go ahead and administer those types of programs. That's all I have for the PowerPoint presentation. Feel free to contact any of your local FSA offices if you have any questions. Like I had mentioned, we will make this PowerPoint available to you so that you can have it with you whenever you need. And feel free to give myself or any of my staff a call in our state office if you have any questions. That's all I've got, Brad. I really appreciate your time.
Thank you very much. I know we have a couple questions building. We will take questions here at the end, so we look forward to coming back to that. That's a reminder to others, if you have questions as we go, please use the Q&A feature in the webinar to do that. Pat, if you can go ahead and stop sharing your screen, I'll ask Brach to share his, and we'll briefly talk through the NRCS side of this portfolio as well.
Great. Thanks, Brad. Let me get mine pulled up here.
All right.
Let me know when you can see my screen. I'll start the show.
We see the screen. Go ahead and start the show. And we see your slides. Great. So I'll turn it to you.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brad. Again, my name is Brach Johnson. I'm the State Outreach Coordinator for the Natural Resources Conservation Service here in Lincoln. And I just wanted to cover a few things that NRCS does in response to drought in the state. We have two primary functions that we do. One, we assist agency response to drought declaration. Pat had mentioned that the ECP program and some of the other programs we administer, we help document forage loss and things like that. We work with UNL Extension to document those things. So when we get a drought declaration or disaster declaration, that we have the ability to document that and get those funds secured moving forward. So the other thing we do is support USDA participants with our own programs and technical assistance. So we have a reactionary type of practices that we use or can utilize to help farmers and ranchers improve their resistance to drought moving forward. So we do have one program that we can utilize for emergency drought assistance, and I'll cover that here in just a second. The way we assist the response, again, like I said, we take roadside surveys. We work with farmers directly, have conversations with them to assess their forage balances specifically, and then they can kind of help us compute what their losses are and what their need is for forage. Generally, it's with our grazing customers. And then we work with our local food and agriculture council, and then we relay that information to the state food and agriculture, or SFAC. NRCS has a emergency watershed protection program for drought. Typically, that's a program that we use after the flooding a couple of years ago in 2019. And this program, it does work for drought also. So where roads are damaged from, if we have an extended drought period and we have wildfires like we've had recently this spring, that program can help entities with repairing road structures. Usually it's embankments and abutments to bridges and things like that. But we do have that available and have called upon those funds in that program on occasion for drought. Another program that we administer here at NRCS is the Conservation Stewardship Program. That program has been around since 2004. The way this program works is it makes a payment to producers, cropland and pasture and range. It makes a stewardship payment for being a good steward of the land. So it rewards the best and it motivates and incentivizes the rest to increase the level of stewardship that's performed on their farm. And then our flagship program for drought response would be the Environmental Quality Incentive Program. The acronym we use for that is EQIP. Three main focuses with that program. We have structural practices that we can help administer, management practices we implement, And then again, some disaster assistance practices also. This is a map I got from our public affairs specialist, just identifying some of the wildfires that we've had the last couple of years here. And one of the programs that is currently running is our it's a disaster assistance program. We keep some money back from our EQIP program every year for disaster, and we were able to take some of those funds, and we started a sign up for the Road 739 Wildfire Assistance Initiative. And certainly there's other counties involved in this, but Phelps, Gosper, Frontier, Furnace County, Red Willow, some of the fires associated or the counties associated with that fire, you can go into your local USDA service center, contact the NRCS in those counties. And there's other counties involved also that program has funds available. So if you had either cropland or range or pastoral land impacted by wildfire, I would just contact your local NRCS office and see if there's some assistance they can give you. The two primary practices that we're funding under that disaster initiative is our prescribed grazing practice, and the practices within that we're really focusing on are livestock deferment, where we can defer grazing for a year and provide a full year. We can take two different types of reduced forage on the pasture or range land, and we're going to base that on an estimated use from 50 to 75%, or between 75% and 100% use. Ultimately, again, I contact your NRCS office to find out the details of how that works. On cropland with that disaster program, we're covering one practice, and that is our cover crop practice. And the intent there is to increase our soil health long term. There's several scenarios that we would look at with that. If you can't get a crop, we've lost a lot of residue off the surface of the soil. And if you wanted to plant soybeans this year, we could do a cover crop after the soybeans would be an example of where we would utilize the cover crop practice. Also, we could do a cover crop now, early on, and no-till seed into maybe soybeans or a short season corn if that would provide some cover. We also have the ability to do early start waivers on these practices. So the sign up, we're having 3 application cutoff periods for this program. The first one ends tomorrow. And then there's 2 more cutoffs. The final one, the cutoff is going to be end of June, I believe, June 30th. So 3 different cutoffs to obligate funds. Again, if you are in need of any of these practices or want to investigate a little more how they can help you, contact your local NRCS office for that information. These are some actual photos I took during my career. This is a photo from Dodge County back in 2012. One of the things we do with our EQIP program that can help make our pastures and rangeland and cropland more resilient to drought is to increase its resiliency. And for pasture, this photo has a lot going on in it. We've got an abandoned windmill for our water supply. We've got a pond over to the left, a small pond. And then some of our other practices that we utilize would be livestock pipeline, tanks, a well. We can provide assistance for that. We can also provide assistance for dugouts and ponds. And then we really want to focus on the grazing practices, because we want to be able to set up rotational grazing systems to give the pasture or rangeland rest and make the forage better, higher value, and more resilient to drought. This is a photo I took out in Holt County about 15 years ago. We're doing a lot of systems even today with solar arrays and pumps. So these are all practices where we're going to apply for the program, get approved probably in the fall or next winter, and do planning on the land to get these practices implemented. Again, long-term, we're looking at making long-term higher resiliency to drought through all these practices. Prescribed grazing, we're using fence. In this photo, we've got somebody using, this is mob grazing, so we're using high intensity grazing practice here, where we're just putting a lot of hoof on the ground in a short period of time, rotating with temporary fencing. Those are all practices that we do. This photo I took in Antelope County back in 2002. This field on the left, no-till is a great practice to build in resiliency for cropland. And on the left, we've got same soil type, same field. On the right, we've got conventional tillage. On the left, we've got a no-till system. And you can see the wind erosion. This is a Thurman loamy fine sand soil. So made that situation, that system a lot better. We also cost share on irrigation practices on cropland. This is a photo I took 12 years ago, I believe, in Platte County. This is a subsurface drip irrigation or micro irrigation system going in. So we took a system that was on the sand and an unleveled field at about 50% efficient for the delivery of water, turned it into 100% efficient water delivery system. Irrigation and water management on cropland is huge. This is a photo I took of a flow meter and the pivot riser on a farm, on an operation. So we have advanced irrigation and water management is a very popular program that we administer right now through our EQIP program. Very well liked, builds in resiliency to your cropland. And then soil health and drought. We're in a major soil health movement here at NRCS and have been for the last decade or so, where we've really focused on soil health and doing innovative cover crop practices. Again, this helps build resiliency in the soil on your cropland. This is a photo I took in Colfax County on a seeding we did a couple of years ago, a dormancy seeding. This was done at the end of December. And then we also are utilizing the forage. So this is a picture of that same field in the early part of June. And we're grazing those cover crops and creating some forage there for the crop, for the cattle. And then we grazed this hard and then planted a cash crop back into this in a corn, bean, wheat rotation on this particular field. So with that kind of covers our programs. And so Brad, I'll turn that back to you. I'll unshare here.
Brach, thank you very much for that discussion of the NRCS portfolio. Both FSA and NRCS have programs that respond to the emergent needs and the issues we have at the moment. And they both allow you to do some planning and efforts to look ahead to the future and as Brach, as you described it, to improve that resiliency and that drought management for what we know is another drought to come at another time. So I appreciate having you on, all three of you now, Randy and Pat and Brach, to go over some questions. Pat, I think the first couple questions may start with you and we'll build from there. You mentioned relative to the LFP program that it triggers based on drought during the grazing season. Can you clarify, and you mentioned, I think the grazing season started May 1, at least for some species. Can you clarify first what the grazing seasons are? And then I have a second part of the question as to when eligibility starts.
Yes. The grazing season for brome, your cool season and your warm season grasses in Nebraska is May 1 to October 15th. And okay. When we take a look at, I guess you want to ask the second part of the question, Brad, go ahead.
Yeah, well, and let me clarify, are there any other species with a different date? There are sometimes
we do have
forages or something, right?
Yes, we do have a small grains grazing season that we look at, starts, I believe, April 1. So we do have a small grains grazing season also as well.
Okay. So then related to the first, let's assume it's that brome or native grass started May 1. Some of those counties triggered because they were already in D3 in the early May map. Does that still trigger even if the cattle have not yet gone out? Sometimes cattle are sent out to pasture. You know, I can remember traditional trips to the pasture on Memorial Day weekend. When does the eligibility start, and does it depend on when the cattle are sent out, or does it depend on the May 1?
That's a really good question. And there's a lot of dynamics to the answer to that question. But in particular, once your county has hit D3 during the grazing season, you qualify for that 3-month pay, or excuse me, once your county hits D3 in that grazing season, so anytime from May 1 to October 15th, you qualify for that 3-month payment. Now, when we take a look at when your livestock come on to that grass, the thing that we're going to take a look at is, was there risk in that at the time of that disaster event in that grass? So it can be a little bit confusing, or there's a little bit of regulation involved as to when you're considered to have risk in that grass. Now, if you're paid up, if your lease runs, if the lease just states maybe May through October 15th, and then when you come onto that grass is maybe determined by growth or things like that, then I think we're okay to say there's risk in that grass. But if there's a lease agreement that maybe says, you June 1 to October 15th, and that drought triggers on May 1, then we may run into a little bit of eligibility issues when we're taking a snapshot of that disaster event. Now I can tell you, we've been working with our national office in Nebraska, taking a look at that policy and what it really means as far as risk in that grass at the snapshot, because we want to make sure, at least in Nebraska, that we're not disqualifying anyone based on some of those time frames and those snapshots.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So Pat, I think that clarifies the question, answers that we got coming in. Let me ask then on the tail end too. You sort of described the same thing, and Randy, this points to some management questions. If I have to pull cattle off early because there's not grass out there, does that stop my eligibility for further assistance, or is that recognizing that the season's worth of grass has come up short?
A lot of that has to do on how your lease agreement is arranged. So ultimately, the way the policy sits is that if you're taken off that grass and you're not paid through the year, you may lose eligibility for LFP. It's one of those things that's a little bit difficult to navigate through, and I know everybody's situation and everybody's lease arrangement is different.
You bet. So important clarification: eligibility and potential relief is generally spelled out, but is subject to details, and that's why you need to visit and confirm at the office, right?
Yes. Yep. Exactly.
And Randy, to follow that up, so you can't make good management decisions on the herd based on what the program may or may not pay. You're still making management decisions based on the grass you have, and talk briefly about what recommendations producers have for when to move cattle if they need.
So we've had drought talk earlier, and if your forage production is down 20% and you put in the same number of cows, you're gonna have to get off earlier, right? So the recommendation would be to reduce stocking rate or reduce the number of cows, get rid of those old cows, and in some cases you might even have to sell some cows or find other places. So you could do confined feeding with your cows. We have at Nebraska, we have rations for that. But right now, if you look at the cost of that, it is really high because our feed costs are high, our gas costs are high, and there's not a lot of hay out there, right? Not a lot of forage because we're low. So those are all things that you can consider. But the grass will only take you so far. When you're out of grass, you're out of grass. You got to do something different.
You bet. Understood. All right. We have a follow-up. We've got a couple questions in the hopper, but I think there's a follow-up to the detail here, Pat. Typical 5-month grazing season. The lease is for 5 months. Some of the payments due on the way in, some of the payments due on the way out. But if the cattle have to leave in 4 months because of reduced forage, and then they only have to pay for 4 months instead of 5,
Yeah.
how does that happen? What detail can you give here?
Well, unfortunately, we'll have to, the county office would have to dive into that lease agreement. But there may be some eligibility issues when it comes to that stuff. And unfortunately, that's just the way LFP is designed right now. If we're getting taken off and we're reducing, the months, there definitely is some eligibility issues that could come into play.
It could be possible that some payments, but maybe not full payments happen, or is that either a yes or a no?
It could be either, I should say.
All of the above. Okay.
Yeah.
Right. Complicated issues demand good local discussion here. Okay. Another question related to the program, and again, another lease arrangement. Explain how the landowner and the tenant participate or benefit from the relief programs when they happen.
Primarily, what LFP is designed for is for the individuals that have risk in the grass, and then they also have to have the risk in the livestock. So if we're looking for LFP to meet the needs of the landowner, and maybe the operator, we would have to see both the livestock risk and the grass risk from both people. So if they were to run, herds together or have a share in those livestock, then we may see, where both the landowner and the operator benefit from the livestock forage program. But
okay.
Just at face value, it's risk in livestock and risk in grass.
Okay. Brach, we've got one question for you here that I want to wrap up with, but I've got sort of an add-on here, Pat. If the cattle ended up staying in the dry lot because there simply wasn't enough grass to even send them out, they still would be eligible for LFP. If they have risk in the cattle and they had risk in the grass, even if they don't get to use the grass, that still meets that guideline, right?
The key there would be that there was the intent that those animals would go to grass. And these were not dry lotted animals. These are animals that had every intention of going to grass.
Okay.
Hey,
Something
Brad,
to clarify in the application process. Yes, Randy?
Sure.
Brad, there's one more question I don't know if you've talked about that I see, and it's types of irrigation for drought.
Yeah, I've got a question there for Brach on
Okay.
irrigation. So,
Okay.
got Brach, the question about irrigation, and you mentioned the EQIP benefits or practices of modifying irrigation and improving efficiency. Someone who has a flood irrigated field, or maybe an older, less efficient center pivot irrigated field, what sort of benefits or what sort of opportunities do they have through EQIP to adopt a more efficient system and continue to raise the corn soybean rotation that they've been in, for example?
Yeah, so we have annual sign-up periods during our normal EQIP ranking and funding process. And so I'd encourage anybody to, visit one of our offices and discuss what the opportunities might be there. Generally speaking, from going from gravity to like center pivot irrigation, let's say, or even subsurface drip, we can, if I've seen different studies on this, but you can go from maybe 50% efficient in a worst case scenario on gravity irrigation. And then with subsurface drip, we're actually at the 100% efficient delivery of the water. Some of our facilitating practices with just not only the conversion from the gravity to center pivot or subsurface drip would be the irrigation water management. So we're managing the water in real time with probes that have they're inserted in the ground to a rooting depth of whatever crop you're growing. And then that information comes back to the producer real time via telemetry, and they're able to make good management decisions. So irrigation water management is a practice. Another facilitating practice would be underground pipeline to convey the water from a wellhead or wherever the water source is to the distribution portion of the irrigation system. We also have a combustion engine energy practice that could be coupled with that. So there's a whole suite of practices that we can utilize, but certainly saving the water is our number one goal. And so again, visit our NRCS offices where we've got a lot of really qualified personnel that can help you through those decisions and get those questions answered.
Thank you, Brach. I think that wraps up our questions. I've got one more here that to clarify the discussion we just had at Pat on the dry lighting cattle. If the intention was to graze and they had risk in both the grass and the cattle, and the intention was to graze but they couldn't, then yes, they may be eligible for LFP, correct?
Yes, the way that the procedure reads is that the livestock must have been or would have been grazing eligible land during the normal grazing season. So I think when we're talking about would have been, if there's not availability.
Okay. So that does not address producers who have adopted a dry lighting practice as a general practice. It addresses
Right.
producers who secured grass resources or had grass resources that they intended to use but could not use.
Yep.
Okay. We have gotten through our questions. We have just moved past the hour here, and so I appreciate the time for those that have participated. A substantial audience here to hopefully receive some timely information, and also to think ahead about some of those practices that we can do a better job of or incentivize here over the longer run. So my thanks to everyone for joining online. My thanks particularly to our presenters today. Randy, your insight on where we are and what the issues have been. Pat, your discussion of FSA programs, and Brach, your discussion of NRCS programs. We greatly appreciate the discussion and the insight today. So I want to clarify and note for our audience that a recording of this webinar will be available soon on our website at cap.unl.edu. Of course, at the same website, you can also see our upcoming schedule and register for our upcoming webinars. Next week, coming up on Monday, in fact, is a special time, but coming up on Monday is our latest webinar on cash rental rates, land values, and leasing issues as part of the Ag Land Management Quarterly. So look for that right away early next week. Otherwise, look to the schedule and see what the upcoming webinars will offer here as well. As you leave, you'll have an opportunity to click the link, and well, the link is there now in the chat box. You have an opportunity to click that link and take a brief survey if you'd like to provide feedback on the day and on the general webinar series overall. So again, thanks to our panel this afternoon, to the collaboration with FSA and NRCS. We hope this information gives you a perspective and some valuable info on how we respond right now in the midst of drought conditions, and how we think ahead to what we can do in the months and years ahead. So thank you to everyone for participating, and I can officially say to all of Nebraska, good afternoon.